The most important person in this hospital pushes a mop, and nobody even knows it. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, St. Matthew Medical Center looked nothing like the polished advertisements shown on television. The hallways were quieter. The light seemed softer. The exhausted staff moved more slowly. And deep inside the intensive care unit, a man in grey maintenance clothes guided a yellow mop bucket across the floor while most people walked past him without a second glance. His name tag read Mike. At least, that was the name everyone knew. What nobody knew was that Mike was actually Mason Carter, the billionaire founder and chief executive officer of the entire Carter Health Systems network. For nearly 3 months, Mason had disappeared from boardrooms, investor meetings, and luxury offices. Instead, he spent his nights cleaning floors, collecting trash bags, and listening. He wanted to see what happened when nobody knew who he was. He wanted the truth. The real truth. The truth hidden behind reports, presentations, and carefully crafted numbers. As he pushed the mop down the hallway outside the ICU, he watched doctors rushing between rooms and nurses finishing endless paperwork. Most people barely noticed him. Some did not even look in his direction. But one person always did. Hannah Brooks. Mason first noticed her during his second week undercover. While everyone else hurried past him, she had stopped and smiled. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extraordinary. Just a simple smile. Yet somehow it felt more genuine than conversations he had experienced in executive offices worth millions of dollars. Since then, he found himself looking forward to every shift where she was assigned to the ICU. Tonight was no different. Through the glass doors, he spotted Hannah checking a patient's monitor. Her light blue scrubs were slightly wrinkled after a 12-hour shift. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes. Yet she still moved from room to room with patience and kindness. Mason watched as she adjusted a blanket for an elderly patient, spoke gently to a worried family member, and helped a young nurse who looked overwhelmed. Not once did she complain. Not once did she act as though anyone was beneath her. A few minutes later, Hannah stepped into the hallway carrying 2 paper cups. She noticed Mason near the supply closet and walked toward him. "You are still here?" she asked. Mason smiled. "Looks like it." Hannah handed him one of the cups. "Coffee." Mason looked down at the handwritten message she had scribbled on the side with a black marker. "Hang in there, Mike." His chest tightened unexpectedly. "You really did not have to do this." Hannah shrugged. "You always work the worst hours." She offered a tired smile. "Somebody should be nice to you." For a moment, Mason forgot about stock prices, hospital acquisitions, and corporate strategy. He simply stared at the paper cup in his hands. Nobody had written him a message like that in years. Hannah checked her watch and sighed. "I should get back." "Long night?" Mason asked. She laughed softly. "When is it not?" Then she disappeared through the ICU doors again. Mason remained standing in the empty hallway holding the warm cup. Around him, machines beeped softly. Nurses moved between rooms. The hospital continued its endless rhythm. But for the first time in a very long time, the billionaire CEO was not thinking about business. He was thinking about a nurse who treated a janitor like he mattered. Hannah Brooks moved through the ICU hallway with measured steps, adjusting monitors and speaking quietly to patients, her soft voice and calm presence filling the sterile air with reassurance. She paused to check a chart at the nurse's station, her fingers tracing the notes with practiced precision, eyes scanning each line carefully as if every detail mattered for more than just the paperwork. Outside, rain pattered against the windows, streaking silver down the glass and reflecting the dim fluorescent lights overhead. She carried herself with quiet authority, treating everyone she encountered with respect, from fellow nurses to the cleaning staff, never letting hierarchy interfere with compassion. In the corner of the hallway, Mason Carter continued pushing the mop bucket, deliberately staying in the shadows to observe her unguarded moments. He noted how she paused to gently soothe a worried patient's family, how she adjusted the blankets and repositioned the oxygen mask without complaint, how her hands moved with care and precision, and how her expression held a soft intensity, a mix of determination and empathy that drew his attention more than any corporate meeting ever had. He found himself studying the curve of her smile when she noticed a young patient's eyes flicker open, the way she leaned slightly closer to offer comfort, the subtle nod to a doctor passing by. She walked past him, unaware he was watching, and handed a cup of coffee to a fellow night shift nurse, smiling softly at the exhaustion etched on their face. Mason lingered a moment longer, letting the image of her kindness settle in his mind, realizing that this ordinary act of compassion carried more weight than anything he had ever experienced in the boardroom. When Hannah returned to her own station, she caught a glimpse of Mason's figure near the supply closet. "Still here?" she asked without judgment, offering him a tired but genuine smile. Mason straightened slightly, returning the gesture with a nod and a quiet, "Looks like it." She handed him a fresh cup of coffee, and he noticed the small message scrawled on the side, "Hang in there, Mike." The word struck him unexpectedly, and he felt a warmth he had not anticipated, a connection that transcended the false identity he carried and the role he had assumed to observe the hospital. Hannah glanced at her watch and sighed softly. "I should get back," she said, turning toward the ICU rooms. Mason held the cup in his hands, observing her retreating figure, feeling a rare moment of quiet peace amidst the hum of monitors and the distant echoes of hospital life, realizing that for the first time in months, the person he wanted to impress was unaware of his true identity, and yet she had already captured his attention and respect in ways that no title, wealth, or position ever had. For the next several nights, Mason continued his undercover routine, navigating the quiet hallways and dimly lit corners of the hospital while observing every detail of life within the ICU. Each evening, he pushed the mop bucket along the polished floors, listening carefully to conversations, watching the rhythms of the staff, and noting the way patients responded to kindness. Hannah Brooks remained a constant in his line of sight. She moved with a deliberate, gentle efficiency, checking monitors, adjusting full lines, and offering words of comfort to those who needed it most. Mason saw her pause to help a young nurse struggling with a heavy tray of supplies, her voice calm and encouraging, and he felt a growing respect for her patience and empathy. He noticed how she laughed quietly at a patient's joke, how she adjusted a blanket just so, how she paused for a second to breathe before moving on to the next task, always prioritizing the needs of others over her own fatigue. At times, Mason would catch her glancing toward the hallway where he worked, her eyes meeting his briefly before she returned her attention to the patients. Those fleeting interactions became the highlight of his nights, moments of connection that he could not ignore despite the careful disguise he maintained. One evening, she handed him a paper cup of coffee with a note scrawled in familiar handwriting, "Hang in there, Mike." The simplicity of the gesture, the thought behind it, struck Mason deeply, more than any corporate accolade or boardroom triumph ever had. He held the cup carefully, as if it contained the very essence of the humanity he had been searching for, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel something beyond observation, admiration, gratitude, and a hint of affection. Hannah did not know who he truly was, and that made every smile, every gesture, every word she spoke more genuine and unguarded. Mason began to understand why she was so admired by her colleagues, why patients responded to her with trust, and why her presence seemed to lift the atmosphere of the entire unit. He continued to follow her quietly, recording small mental notes about her habits, her kindness, and the way she interacted with everyone around her. Each night, he learned more about what made her extraordinary, and each night, the disguise he wore felt both necessary and increasingly heavy as the feelings he could not yet name began to grow. In the silence between the beeping monitors and the faint hum of the fax system, Mason realized that the woman who treated a janitor like an equal had already become the anchor for his attention and the focus of an emotional journey he had not anticipated, and as Hannah walked past him once more, smiling softly at a patient, he felt the first stirrings of hope that perhaps the connection he longed for might be mutual. One rainy evening, Mason pushed the mop bucket down the long ICU hallway, the yellow wheels squeaking softly on the wet tile, while the fluorescent lights flickered above, casting elongated shadows along the walls. Hannah Brooks moved with precision from room to room, checking vital signs and offering quiet reassurance to a young patient who was frightened and restless. She glanced at the monitor, adjusting it, then bent down slightly to straighten the blankets around the child, her expression soft but determined. Mason paused nearby, leaning subtly against the wall, observing without drawing attention. He watched the way her hands moved, each motion efficient yet gentle, how she spoke calmly to the patient, her words carrying warmth that made even the machine-filled room feel less intimidating. When Hannah finally turned toward the supply closet for more gloves, her eyes met his for a brief moment, and she gave him a tired but genuine smile. Mason felt an unexpected flutter of recognition and gratitude, though she had no idea who he really was. He continued down the hallway, rounding the corner near the medication station, watching her interact with fellow nurses, offering advice, sharing a small joke to lighten a tense moment. The rhythmic sound of rain hitting the windows outside accompanied the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional murmur of voices from distant rooms, creating a symphony of quiet activity. Mason took note of the little details, the way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear, the careful way she adjusted the oxygen tube for a patient, the small nod she offered a colleague after successfully calming a distressed family member. Then, as if sensing the long night ahead, Hannah took a small step back and poured 2 cups of coffee, one for herself and one for the janitor she had seen multiple nights before. "Here," she said, extending the cup to Mason. He took it gently, noticing the simple message written on the side in black marker, "Hang in there, Mike." The word struck him more than anything else that night, and he realized how much her kindness mattered, not to him as a CEO or a businessman, but to the person she believed him to be, a hard-working janitor on the night shift. She nodded politely and turned back to the rooms, disappearing down the corridor, and Mason remained standing, cup in hand, absorbing the quiet dignity and humanity she radiated, thinking about how one person's simple, genuine acts could illuminate an entire hospital wing. As he continued his rounds, carefully maneuvering the mop around beds and chairs, he reflected on the growing connection he felt to Hannah, the silent understanding forming between them, and the anticipation that each night might bring another moment where her care, completely unaware of his true identity, would touch him in ways no corporate achievement ever could, leaving him wondering how long he could maintain the disguise before the inevitable reveal would change everything. The following night, Mason found himself lingering in the hallway outside the ICU longer than usual, the mop bucket resting idly beside him while he observed Hannah Brooks moving from patient to patient. Each time she checked a monitor or adjusted a blanket, her focus and patience were unwavering, her soft-spoken words bringing calm to patients who were frightened, sick, or alone. Mason noted the way she interacted with her colleagues as well, offering encouragement, a quick smile, or a gentle reminder, always maintaining an aura of competence and warmth. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows and creating reflective patterns on the polished floors, enhancing the quiet intimacy of the hospital at night. As she passed him, Mason offered a quiet nod, and Hannah responded with a small smile, oblivious to his true identity. Later, she returned from the supply closet carrying 2 cups of coffee, her hand steady despite exhaustion. "Here," she said, extending one to Mason. He accepted it carefully, noticing the handwritten message on the cup, "Hang in there, Mike." The simple gesture struck a chord deep within him, reminding him of the humanity he had been seeking and of the woman who had unknowingly become the center of his attention. He lingered in the corridor, holding the warm cup and watching as she checked on a patient struggling to sleep, tucking the blanket around them with a practiced tenderness that spoke to a lifetime of caring. The lights of the ICU flickered softly, and Mason allowed himself to breathe for the first time in weeks without thinking about schedules, shareholders, or board meetings. Each night, he recorded mental notes of her behavior, the way she balanced efficiency and compassion, the way she laughed softly at a patient's joke, and the quiet authority with which she moved through her domain. Mason began to anticipate these nightly encounters, the brief conversations at the supply closet, the coffee handoffs, and the fleeting glances that seemed to linger just a fraction longer than necessary. He realized that what he felt was no longer curiosity or mere admiration but a growing, undeniable connection that rooted him to the floor of this quiet hospital corridor, a feeling far stronger than any boardroom triumph he had ever experienced. As Hannah moved toward the nurses' station one final time for the night, Mason followed at a respectful distance, taking in every movement, every gesture, and every moment of genuine care. The rhythmic hum of monitors, the soft patter of rain, and the warm glow of overhead lights created a cocoon in which their silent bond could grow unnoticed by the rest of the world. He held the cup to his chest, feeling its warmth, and with it, the knowledge that his undercover mission had revealed something far more valuable than the workings of a hospital. It had revealed the extraordinary character of a woman whose quiet kindness had captured the attention, respect, and heart of the man who had once ruled from a throne of wealth and power. As the weeks passed, Mason began measuring time differently. He no longer counted quarters, acquisitions, or investor calls. Instead, he counted coffee cups, late-night conversations, and the brief moments when Hannah Brooks smiled at him across the ICU hallway. On a quiet Thursday night, the hospital seemed unusually calm. The rain had finally stopped, and moonlight filtered through the large windows overlooking the parking lot. The polished floors reflected the soft glow of overhead lights as Mason slowly pushed his yellow mop bucket past the nurse's station. Hannah sat reviewing charts, her brow slightly furrowed in concentration. A half-finished cup of coffee rested beside her keyboard. Mason noticed how tired she looked. For the first time since beginning his undercover assignment, he felt something he could not easily explain. It was not admiration. It was not curiosity. It was concern. Real concern. He found himself wondering whether she was sleeping enough, whether she had eaten dinner, whether anyone ever took care of the woman who spent every night caring for everyone else. As he approached the station, Hannah looked up and smiled. "Hey, Mike." The simple greeting immediately brightened his mood. "Long night?" he asked. Hannah laughed softly. "That is becoming our standard conversation." Maybe because the answer is always yes. She nodded. "Fair point." For a moment, neither spoke. The familiar comfort of their growing friendship settled naturally between them. Then Hannah closed the chart and leaned back in her chair. "Can I ask you something?" Mason felt his heartbeat quicken slightly. "Sure." She studied him for a second. "Why do you always seem so calm?" Mason almost laughed. If she only knew how many billion-dollar decisions he normally carried on his shoulders. "I do not know," he replied carefully. "Maybe I have learned that most problems get smaller when you stop panicking." Hannah smiled thoughtfully. "I wish more people thought that way." Before he could answer, a call light illuminated down the hallway. Hannah immediately stood. "Duty calls." She disappeared into a patient room. Mason watched her go, once again amazed by how naturally she placed others before herself. Later that night, near 2 o'clock in the morning, Hannah emerged from the break room carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee. She walked directly toward him. "I figured you could use this." Mason accepted the cup and glanced down. Written on the side in black marker were the familiar words. "Hang in there, Mike." He smiled. "You never forget." Hannah shrugged. "Everyone needs encouragement sometimes." The statement lingered in his mind long after she returned to work. Everyone needs encouragement sometimes. Nobody had spoken to him like that in years. Most people spoke to the CEO. Hannah spoke to the person. As the night continued, Mason found himself standing outside a patient room watching Hannah comfort an elderly woman who seemed frightened about an upcoming procedure. There were no cameras. No supervisors. No recognition waiting for her. Yet she gave the same kindness she always did. In that moment, something shifted inside him. The undercover mission that had started as an investigation into hospital operations had become something entirely different. Mason realized he was no longer staying because of the hospital. He was staying because of Hannah. And for the first time, the thought of eventually revealing who he really was filled him not with confidence, but with fear that he might lose the one person who had come to know him without the title. The following week brought a shift in the atmosphere of St. Matthew Medical Center. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with a few conversations whispered near the nurse's station and a handful of emails sent late at night by hospital administrators. But within days, the concern became impossible to ignore. Staffing schedules were changing. Budgets were being reviewed. Entire departments were suddenly being asked to operate with fewer resources. One evening, as Mason pushed his mop bucket through the ICU corridor, he noticed several nurses gathered around a computer screen. Their expressions were tense. Hannah stood among them, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Unlike her usual calm demeanor, there was frustration in her eyes. Mason slowed his pace without drawing attention to himself. He overheard enough to understand the situation. A group of investors was pressuring hospital leadership to reduce operational costs before the next financial quarter. The proposal included eliminating several night shift nursing positions throughout the network. The plan looked efficient on paper. But Mason knew exactly what would happen in reality. Fewer nurses would mean longer hours, slower response times, and more exhausted staff. Most importantly, patients would receive less attention. The very thing he had spent months observing. Later that night, Hannah sat alone in the break room reviewing staffing projections. Mason entered quietly carrying a trash bag. He intended to leave immediately, but she looked up. "Can I ask you something, Mike?" He nodded. "Do you think people in charge ever actually see what happens here?" The question caught him off guard. Hannah sighed heavily. Some executive sitting in a glass office thinks removing a few nurses saves money. She shook her head. But they never see the patients. They never see what happens at 2 o'clock in the morning when one nurse is responsible for too many people. Mason listened silently. Every word felt like a direct challenge to the version of himself that existed outside these walls. "Maybe they just do not understand," he said carefully. Hannah laughed softly, but there was sadness behind it. "Then they should come here and learn." The word stayed with him long after he left the room. Over the next several days, Mason paid even closer attention. He watched nurses skip breaks because they were short-staffed. He saw Hannah stay nearly an hour after her shift ended helping a patient whose family could not arrive until morning. He noticed young nurses struggling to keep up while still trying to provide compassionate care. Everything Hannah had said was true. The numbers on spreadsheets could never capture these moments. One evening, while reviewing reports in his private apartment after leaving the hospital, Mason opened the latest financial recommendations from senior leadership. He stared at the proposal calling for staffing reductions. Then he thought about Hannah walking exhausted through the ICU. He thought about the patients whose names would never appear in quarterly earnings reports. Slowly, he closed the document. For the first time since beginning his undercover mission, he knew exactly what decision he would make as CEO. But there was another realization growing inside him as well. Every major choice he considered now seemed connected to one person. Hannah had started as part of his investigation. Somewhere along the way, she had become the reason he wanted to make the hospital better. And as he looked at the coffee cup she had given him days earlier, still sitting carefully on his desk with the words hanging there, Mike written across the side, he realized that protecting the ICU was no longer just a business decision. It had become personal. The tension that had been building for weeks finally reached a breaking point on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Unlike the quiet nights Mason had grown accustomed to, the hospital buzzed with nervous energy. Staff members whispered in hallways. Department heads moved quickly between offices. An emergency leadership meeting had been scheduled on the top floor of the administration building, and rumors spread throughout the hospital that major staffing decisions were about to be announced. Hannah spent most of her shift trying to ignore the speculation. She focused on her patients, reviewed charts, and completed her rounds, but the concern lingered in the back of her mind. By late afternoon, she found herself standing outside the break room with several other nurses discussing the possible cuts. "If they reduce the night shift again, I do not know how we keep doing this," one nurse said quietly. Hannah nodded. "The patients are already waiting longer than they should." Her voice carried frustration she rarely allowed herself to show. People making these decisions should spend 1 week in the ICU before changing anything. Several nurses agreed immediately. Unknown to them, the person they were talking about had heard every word. Later that evening, Hannah received a message asking her to attend a special hospital-wide staff meeting in the main conference center. The request seemed unusual, but she assumed it was related to the budget discussions. When she arrived, hundreds of employees had already gathered. Nurses, technicians, physicians, administrators, and support staff filled the room. The atmosphere felt tense and uncertain. Hannah found a seat near the back beside several co-workers. As she looked around, she noticed something strange. Mike was nowhere to be seen. For the first time in months, the familiar janitor and his yellow mop bucket were absent. She told herself it should not matter. Yet she felt unexpectedly disappointed. A few moments later, the lights dimmed. Conversations faded. A senior executive stepped onto the stage and approached the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "Today, we are joined by someone who has spent the last several months learning firsthand about the realities of this hospital." Hannah frowned. The statement seemed oddly specific. Then the executive smiled. "Please welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Carter Health Systems, Mr. Mason Carter." The room erupted into applause. Hannah looked toward the stage automatically. Then she froze. A tall man stepped into the spotlight wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. The applause grew louder. Hannah could not hear it anymore. Her entire world seemed to stop. Because the man standing under the lights was not a stranger. It was Mike. The janitor. The man who pushed a mop through the ICU every night. The man who drank coffee from paper cups with handwritten encouragement. The man she had trusted. The man she thought she knew. Mason's eyes moved across the crowd until they found hers. For a brief moment, everything else disappeared. Hannah stared at him in disbelief. Her heart pounded. Questions flooded her mind faster than she could process them. Why had he lied? How long had he been pretending? Was any of it real? Mason stepped closer to the microphone. 3 months ago, he began, "I entered this hospital disguised as a janitor because I wanted to see the truth." Hannah felt the room spinning around her. The reveal she never imagined had finally arrived. And nothing would ever be the same again. The applause continued around the conference center, but Hannah Brooks could barely hear it. The faces of hundreds of employees blurred together as she stared at the stage. Her mind refused to connect the two people standing before her. Mike, the quiet janitor who drank coffee with her during overnight shifts, and Mason Carter, the billionaire founder of the entire hospital network. Yet they were the same man. Every conversation. Every smile. Every late-night encounter in the ICU hallway suddenly felt different. Mason continued speaking at the podium, explaining why he had spent months undercover, but Hannah struggled to focus on the words. All she could think about was one question. Why did he never tell me? Around her, employees listened attentively. Some looked impressed. Others seemed shocked. Hannah felt neither. She felt hurt. After the meeting ended, groups of staff gathered throughout the conference center discussing the announcement. Excitement spread quickly through the crowd. Hannah slipped out quietly before anyone could stop her. She walked through the hospital corridors with her emotions tangled together. Confusion. Disappointment. Betrayal. By the time she reached the ICU, the familiar hallways that had once felt comforting now seemed strangely unfamiliar. She stepped into the break room and closed the door behind her. For several minutes, she simply stood there staring at the table where she and Mike had shared countless cups of coffee. Every memory replayed differently now. The conversations. The jokes. The encouragement. Had any of it been real? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Hannah already knew who it was before the door opened. Mason stood in the doorway wearing the same navy suit from the meeting. Without the janitor uniform, he looked completely different. Yet somehow his eyes remained exactly the same. "Hannah," he said quietly. She immediately looked away. "Do not." Mason took a cautious step forward. "Please let me explain." Hannah laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Explain what?" She finally looked at him. "That you spent 3 months lying to me." Mason winced. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did." The words landed harder than she intended. Silence filled the room. Mason lowered his gaze briefly. Everything between us was real. Hannah folded her arms. Was it? Her voice trembled. Because I thought I knew who you were. Mason stepped closer. You knew me better than anyone. Hannah shook her head. No. I knew Mike. The name hung heavily between them. The janitor who worked nights. Mason's expression softened. Mike was part of me. Hannah looked away again. The explanation only made things more painful. You had every opportunity to tell me. Mason nodded slowly. I know. Then why did you not? For a moment, he said nothing. Then he answered honestly. Because every day it became harder. Hannah frowned. Harder? Mason exhaled slowly. The longer I knew you, the more afraid I became. She stared at him. Afraid of what? His eyes met hers. Afraid that once you learned who I really was, everything would change. Hannah's heart tightened unexpectedly. Yet the hurt remained stronger. Without another word, she picked up her bag from the table. Mason watched her carefully. Hannah. She paused at the doorway. I need time. Then she walked away. Mason remained standing alone in the empty break room. On the table beside him sat an abandoned paper coffee cup. Across the side, written in black marker, were the familiar words she had written dozens of times. Hang in there, Mike. For the first time since revealing the truth, Mason wondered whether he had just lost the one thing that mattered more to him than the company he built.